Okay, everyone, this is the last session of our workshop. And before I start my presentation, I would like to just give a brief summary of what all the presenters have been discussing. So the initial idea of this workshop was that to come up with certain topics and talks that are kind of interconnected and there is a kind of overlapping similarities between all this connection, and the focus, our target was actually our emerging researchers, and that's why we had the topics that we had chosen for this workshop. I started with focusing on the importance of being articulate in one's voice and in one's thesis statement, in the way one articulate one's ideas, and the importance of that factor in getting published. Then Dr. van der Verve talked about the importance of choosing topics that are more likely to get published, and the platforms that you could find, those topics to engage with them. And then Dr. Swanson talked about the variety of ways we can actually make our abstracts effective, promising, informative, and at the same time, as a result of all these elements, to make them stand out, in the pool of all the abstracts that either conferences or journals receive. And Dr. Bezuidenhout talked about research methodology, and the focus was on research design and coherence. So that was the discussions in the morning, and in the afternoon, Dr. Asektipi talked about literature review, which was extremely informative and insightful in the way that we shouldn't look at literature review as some kind of paying just lip service to what is already there. There's a degree of humility and modesty, which is, I think, is a very fascinating way of looking at it, because it shows that, again, research is a conversation. And then we had our Dr. Nkata, who talked about ways of writing a proposal that is effective and that stands out in the sea of proposals that this organization will receive. Thank you all for these wonderful talks. And as a wrap up, this last conversation, this last talk would be on some ethical consideration that we definitely have to make in our research and while we are doing research. This is a very key distinction, and I'll discuss that, because we'll find out that some of the ethical issues that arises is not before the research, is during the research, when everything is approved, when everything is, when everything is just only about the researcher themselves to decide the way forward when it comes to those issues. Okay, and my focus would be on the Belmont report of 1979, which is a very crucial document. I'll discuss some of the milestones when it comes to ethical movement during the 20th century, and the Belmont report certainly is one of the highest one, because if you look up randomly about the principles of ethical research, there are more likely that you will see the principles of ethical research that were first initiated or discussed in this Belmont report. And it is important at the same time, because we at the IIE as well, we are following, and the principle of ethical research at the IIE is informed by the principle of ethical research according to the Belmont report. So I'll start. So I hope everyone can see the slide. Okay, as an introduction, Let me start with, I mean, most of you are familiar with Stanford Prison Experiment, which was conducted, it started in 14th of August 1971, you know. A psychologist named Philip Zimbardo, I mean, he had this idea that, I mean, influenced by the wave of researchers on the nature of authority and the way we succumb to authority and the way we as human beings, we are part of those evil, you know. So he had this mentality that, you know, the whole idea of violence or inflicting pain is just a matter of, it's a situational thing. You know, it depends on your situation. Based on the situation, you will decide whether you are going to be kind or whether you're going to be cruel, whether you're going. So that was the hypothesis. And then he said, okay, how am I going to do it? This is summer and there are lots of kids out there who, you know, who wouldn't mind having $30, you know, per day. And he started this experimentation in one of the undergrounds of, you know, psychology department in Stanford, you know. So they just made up, you know, a so-called prison, and they divided randomly. Some people were prisoners, some people were guards, and they were just observing the dynamics between these two groups, okay? And what happened during this study that was supposed to be for 2 weeks, it just only took, I think, 5 or 6 days, because the prisoners started to show some serious, you know, symptoms of distress and anxiety and, you know, and pain. Okay, so but today we don't want to talk about, you know, the Stanford prison experience. We just want to come up with certain the implications of being reckless or being not being mindful of the ethical consideration or ethical implications of the way one does, you know, research. Okay, so in 1973, then Zimbardo is writing a paper in Cognition, if I'm not mistaken, and talks about very coolly in this, you know, in this paper about his approach, and I'm quoting here: volunteer prisoners suffered physical and psychological abuse hour after hour for days, while volunteer guards were exposed to the new self-knowledge that they enjoyed being powerful and had abused this power to make other human beings suffer. That's not the whole story, but I'm just taking out this quotation to talk about this notion of inflicting pain or suffering, or thinking about the ethical consideration. Okay, that is just give you, just put some perspective in the whole discussion of why, when it comes to especially end of, you know, 20th century and 21st century, then ethical issues become extremely important, because we have a very dark history when it comes to research and abuse of, you know, power. Research involving human subjects is inevitably bound to face certain moral questions. I'm just, you know, and one of the things I wanted to say at the beginning is that I'm afraid in this presentation I am going to have much more questions that I have answered, okay? But I think it's important to ask those questions, okay? The answer to which we can maybe have in, you know, the conversation we can have another time, but asking those questions is very important. Just think about this simple question as a researcher. What criteria do I use in selecting the participants? Do I need to disclose the hypothesis of my research? Because that could be, you know, if I do that, then what have happened to the notion of, you know, making sure all the research is done in a neutral, you know, manner? What does informed consent mean? Let's just think about when you're thinking with children. What would be wrong in selecting participants that I suspect or I hope would confirm my hypothesis? That is something, I mean, you are doing something and you know that if you go to such and such neighborhood, you'll definitely get the results that you are expecting. You know, is there anything wrong ethically with this, you know, with this attitude? Something is going to confirm my hypothesis, and that is like a jackpot. Why not? What if the result of my research are not statistically significant? I mean, that's another important question that researchers, you know, often face. You know, I have this hypothesis and I see that, you know, the result doesn't doesn't support my hypothesis, and the whole thing look like a failure. What am I going to do with this when I am faced with this situation? And then we also have, when it comes to quantitative, research, there is this obsession with statistical significance. Your research, if it proves something significant statistically, that is something cool. That is something that is publishable. That is something that can that can become viral. Okay, that statistical significance, that obsession with it, it also has some ethical, implications that we have to be mindful of. I mean, here are, there's a quotation from a scientist that would say, I feel torn between asking questions that I know will lead to a statistical significance and asking questions that matter. Or imagine you engage in a research, the result of which could be considered a failure since it doesn't support your hypothesis. What would you do? When you are dealing with this, everything is said, the proposal is approved, you have certain findings, but then this question remains. So if I want to, this is some really selective, and I could even say, I don't know, not random, because there are some key, overlapping similarities between them. But when you think of the 20th century and the way research has been done, I mean, here are, like you can see throughout the years, we have had some serious cases, and we could call it milestone in ethical development, either the experiment that have gone so wrong, or certain declaration or movement, or or agreements that speak about the significance of paying attention to the ethical implications of research. When you think of, for example, in 1932, Tuskegee experiment on syphilis, the way the whole thing was handled on rural American in the 1932, or Nazi experiment on the prisoner in concentration camps. In 1944, we had right through 1974, we had human radiation experiments by the US government. 1946, we have Nuremberg trial of doctors responsible for the Nazi experiment. 1947, we had the first code of ethics that is, specifically speak about paying, attention to the ethical consideration when one does research, which was a response, which was a reaction to actually what was happening during 1939 to 1994. In 1948, UN adoption of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1961, we had Milgram experiment, which is, kind of a, godfather of the Stanford prison experiment, because the whole, hypothesis of Milgram experiment was also like that situational psychology and the way the context of one's person decides the way they behave, In 1963 to 1966, we have that Willowbrook study, which during which they would, inject, mentally, challenged kids with, hepatitis to see the impacts of it, that was the nature of research. Then in 1964, we have Declaration of Helsinki, which is more comprehensive than the Nuremberg Code. In 1971, again, we have the Stanford prison experiment, and the 1979, the Belmont report. Of course, after the Belmont report, we have had many other, agreements and declarations. But I'm just going to stop here to just show this chain of events that would lead to this increasing awareness about the ethical, implications of one's research. So I'm going to start with 1946, the Nuremberg Code, which was basically it was the driving element of the Nuremberg Code was like it contains, of course, 10 principles, but that defining feature is just this. Focus is on the absolute necessity of avoiding harm. So someone is written that the slides are not moving, so I have no idea, to be honest, what is happening. Can you see now? I am at slide 7. Can you see it?
I can see from my side.
Okay.
I can also see it.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I don't know, maybe there's only one problem. Okay, so I am going to move on. Okay, so the Nuremberg Code is the main focus is just the absolute necessity of avoiding harm when you do research, because it is like just speaking to what was happening, during the World War II. Okay, the Declaration of Helsinki, of course, is much more elaborate than the previous declaration. And the focus of Declaration of Helsinki is on the ethical principle for medical research. Only focus on medical research, but of course it has implications for other disciplines as well. Okay, and the concept of research ethics committee, I think, I suspect, was first introduced here. I mean, I haven't seen that concept, that notion of research ethics committee, or the idea that a group of neutral people supervise the process of approval of a research project was, I think, initially first discussed or introduced in the Declaration of Helsinki. You can see, for example, in the declaration, by quoting, the well-being of the subject should take precedence over the interest of science and society. You can actually see here that that there is a Kantian element of respect for person here, right there in the Declaration of Helsinki, that the person itself, the subject's interest, take precedence over the interest of whatever we call science or society. And also it highlights the importance of informed consent. This notion of informed consent is a very complicated, concept, especially when we are dealing with subjects or participants that, for whatever reasons they are, whether they are psychological, whether they're mentally decapacitated, may or because they haven't reached to that age to be autonomous, then it brings again complication. Okay, and all of them, they were discussed in the Declaration of Helsinki. But the Belmont report that is going to be the focus of today's talk is important because it is much more comprehensive than the previous two codes and declaration. And as I said at the beginning, if you look up randomly any, just whether it is Google Scholar or any university, like the majority of universities, it was interesting that almost it has become part of common knowledge, so to speak, that everyone refers to the Belmont report without even referring to the Belmont report, as if like, okay, now that it was Belmont report, so we don't need to refer to him. But fortunately, at the IIE, it is clearly stated that our principles are informed by the Belmont report. It was initially compiled by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. But as I said, the principles that are broad enough or philosophical enough that you can actually apply to, to many disciplines. And what we did at the IIE is that we have included another, apart from these three principles of respect for person, beneficence, and justice, this notion of be highlighted, that notion of integrity, so that any other disciplines that are conceptual, desk-based, then the notion of integrity is fundamentally important. Okay, so the Belmont report, there are three principles. It introduces this principle, three principles, and it says that all research must follow these three principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And the first one is respect for person. This notion of respect for person is like, without that, is coming from Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics. This idea that human beings, by the capacity of being humans and by the capacity of being rational, their autonomy must be respected, and hence the notion of respect for person. Kant talks about, certain categorical imperative that in every kind of interactions that we have with other, in every course of action that we would like to take, we have to ask two key questions. These two questions, Kant also called them the formula of humanity and the formula of universality. The formula of universality is like saying, can I apply this principle, this maxim that I'm using, to all human beings? If my maxim is that, it is okay to pleasures under certain circumstances, then if I can apply it to all human beings, then Kant would say, that is right there, you have an ethical maxim, But if you can't, you have failed the test, and therefore that is not a ethical maxim. And the second one, which speaks to the notion of respect for person, is the idea of the formula of humanity, that one should consider all human beings not as a means but as an end in themselves. That notion of considering everyone as an end in themselves has, it has been translated by philosophers with this notion of the ethics of respect for persons. So the first principle of the Belmont Report is just a Kantian, principle, and based on which choices of autonomous individuals should be respected. This notion of autonomy is a very tricky concept, because ordinarily we have this notion of that, yeah, everyone is autonomous. What's the big deal? You approach someone and then they say yes or no. But what they forget in this situation is that this notion of autonomy is a very fuzzy concept, because the conditions of life, in a person's, could be in a certain way that the autonomy is undermined. Think of in what sense you could talk about the autonomy of prisoners, or the economy of refugees, or the economy of the vulnerable, the economy of the poor, the autonomy of the poor. So that notion of autonomy shouldn't deceive us, As a researcher, we wouldn't say, okay, we asked them to do this and they signed it, and therefore, what's the big deal? One, I actually see that in the sense that they are saying, isn't that saying yes itself to the research is a sign that they have no idea what you're asking, from them. But because they consider you as a figure of authority, they would say, okay, you have to just say yes to people, because otherwise you'll be deported, otherwise you'll have penalties in prison, otherwise your food stamp will be, denied, otherwise, I'm not going to get this, $10, all these things. So that notion of autonomy is something very important to just think about it. What do we mean by autonomy when we talk about, when we're approaching our subjects? People incapable of making their own choices should be protected. That is another fundamental principle of the Belmont Report, according to respect for persons. And voluntary subjects need adequate information for decision making. And this adequate information, again, then speak to that notion of informed consent that I am going to touch upon shortly. The second principle is beneficence, which says participation in research is associated with a favorable balance of potential benefits and harms. In other words, the research that you are doing, there must be some degree of beneficence for this person. Beneficence, then you can either define it negatively or positively. When you define it negatively, you can consider the beneficence as the avoidance of any kind of inflicting any kind of harm during the process. And in a positive sense, in bringing in something positive, something beneficent, to the lives of those that you are doing research on. Maximize possible benefits, minimize potential harm. These are the things that, according to second principle, we have to make sure that we consider them. And the third principle is talking about the notion of justice. What I found, I mean, the first time I come across the Belmont report and the IIE, adopting this strategy, the beauty of this concept, the notion of, and the way it has become extremely philosophical, the notion of justice and beneficence and respect for person, as if like all kind of research, at the end of the day, they should consider this philosophical, consideration in doing the research. And the principle of justice highlights actually the dark background of the way research has been conducted in the 20th century, as I highlighted in those milestones. Okay, I mean, traditionally it has always been the case that you would do research on the vulnerable, on the poor, on the refugee, on the voiceless, and the benefits of it would be on the haves, on the people who are established, people who are normal, people who are. So that is the absolute, definition of injustice. You are not doing justice in the way you are chosen, because they are not going to benefit from the results of this research. And again, according to this principle, we may not exploit or exclude vulnerable individuals who are at the mercy of authority figures in general. And there are, according to the Belmont report, there are certain applications. There are 3 applications, and one of the key elements is informed consent. And when we talk about the notion of informed consent, there are 3 elements to it. First, information, then comprehension, and then voluntariness. All of these things, I mean, one might receive the information, but if you don't comprehend that information, then you are not having an informed consent. If you receive the information, if you comprehend it, but at the same time you are not given that autonomy to say yes or no, you are not given to, autonomy to, to reject or withdraw at any given time of the research, then again we don't have informed consent. And the Belmont report highlights that when we talk about informed consent, we are talking about all these 3 elements combined. And the second one is assessment of benefits and risk in undertaking any kind of research before, of course, starting the research. Research must be justified on the basis of a favorable benefit-risk assessment for the research participant. In other words, on balance, you have to say, you know what, the benefits of this research is higher than the risk involved in it. And benefits, of course, must outweigh risk. But again, the tricky question is that the notion of outweighing should be used with care and clarity, because what do we mean when we say the benefits outweigh the risk? In what exact sense are we talking about outweighing? And this notion of outweighing is important, become crucial, especially when you are dealing with certain topics that move beyond what we call a normal or a standard, topic. There are an element of risk in it. A risk refers to a harm or likelihood of a harm. The degree of severity of a possible harm may be unclear. A benefit refers to a positive value that accrues to the participant and or to the society. The precise degree of gain that might accrue to the participant and or to the society may be uncertain. That's again that understanding, that acknowledgement that, I might not be able to articulate in a specific way what are the benefits of this research. If you are dealing with that situation, then there are procedures to be had when you are dealing with those cases. Just think of, for example, this research involving vulnerable groups.